Hello and welcome to the Hibs Observer morning debrief. It is the morning after the night before. A disappointing result for Hibs at Easter Road, going down 3-0 to Rangers, their first fixture back since the Premiership winter break. Safe to say, not going to plan at all. New signings on the pitch, new faces, boys returning, but it was a familiar story. Unfortunately, against Rangers at Easter Road. Hibs now, I believe, not beaten Rangers at Easter Road since 2015-16 season. So that is an unwanted record that is starting to drag on a bit. Patrick, what did you make of it? It was a kind of familiar story, wasn't it? Not a great performance all round.
Yeah, it was a familiar story in the end, but I think for maybe the first sort of 25, 30 minutes at a push, I thought Hibs actually looked better. They certainly looked better than they looked at Forfar. I think there was a bit more zip about the way they were playing. Consider the way they were playing just before the winter break, where they just looked really kind of jaded, really kind of leggy all over the park. There was like a bit more. They were a bit more sprightly, and that was promising. They were knocking the ball about quite well. There were sort of the usual unforced errors, but I don't think Rangers were great either, to be honest. In certainly the first sort of half an hour, and I think up until Lundstrom's ball over the top for Yilmaz to score the opener, I thought Hibs had kind of matched them pretty well. Hadn't really had many chances to speak of. But then I think really the killer blow was losing that second goal just before half time, and it was a good goal by Todd Cantwell. But I think if you can keep it at 1-0 to half time, then you go in, you regroup, you come back out, and I think you could see Hibs were actually playing with a kind of a bit more of a kind of renewed vigor when they came back out, and then the manner of losing the third goal and the fact that they had a couple of chances themselves. Mazzani's effort from close range, it was well saved by Butland, and Marcondes later on I think had was crowded out as he was looking to shoot. So I think it started off promising and then just sort of like slid into what we're kind of used to seeing from him, especially against Rangers, against Celtic, and I suppose something that started off so promising in terms of the way they were playing. You're walking away from the game and you're left with like sort of very, very sort of familiar feelings, I think would be the best way to put it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was disappointing all round. I agree. I don't think Hibs were off it to begin with. There wasn't too much in the sort of opening 20-25 minutes. I think Nick Montgomery was probably right when he said that both teams were probably a bit sloppy. In that kind of opening spell, I did think after a while that Hibs set up sort of played into Rangers' hands a wee bit. I felt they were just able to get sort of too many overloads in areas that you don't really want them to. I think even kind of starting from the back, Rangers are building up with a 3 against Hibs 2, and then they're getting the ball into midfield, and again it was becoming a 3v2 at times. It was a lot to ask of Dylan Levitt and Joe Newell up against Lundstrom, Cantwell, and Raskin. I think obviously there was a slight change in how Hibs have lined up, and that it was Mazzani Malida who was kind of playing off the front with Dylan Vente pushed forward. I don't really want to criticise Mazzani too much because I think he gets a pass for it being his first game. The guy's barely kicked the ball for several months, and when he has, it's been second tier in Germany. He's been away on international. Fourth tier, sorry, God. Well, there you go then. He did look a bit rusty, maybe a bit off match fitness, and maybe not quite up to speed with sort of the system that Hibs were playing. But I did think it kind of left a lot for Joe Newell and Dylan Levitt to try and cover. And I think just a kind of a side note, actually, like I think everybody was happy when the team sheet came out and you seen that Dylan Vente was now back playing higher up the park. But I think there was periods in that game where it's showed why Nick Montgomery has played him where he has for the past while, because to play in that sort of supporting role off the front, you do need a fair degree of sort of tactical discipline, tactical awareness as to where, how you can help stop those overloads, the 3v2 in the middle of the park. And it's just Mazzani, I just didn't think wasn't able to do that quite effectively, as effectively as the game wore on. I mean, it's not. I'm not saying that he wasn't, putting a shift in. He was. He did a lot of running about, but it's just kind of knowing where to be, when to drop off, when to press. And I just felt as the game wore on, that started to move more in Rangers' favour. I think it was maybe masked a wee bit in the opening stages because both teams were sloppy on the ball. But I certainly think it told in the first two goals. The first goal, Lundstrom is able to, he's able to step onto the game unchallenged from, that's your holding midfielder who's stepping into the final third and nobody really getting anywhere near him. And I think what it does at times when you are a midfield two and you're facing that three, the natural, and you can feel yourself maybe, getting outnumbered. The natural tendency is to, I think, is to kind of drop off it a wee bit, because you don't want to then find yourself being pulled, pillar to post, chasing shadows. So I think there can be at times a sort of natural tendency to take a step back, just hold your shape. And I thought it contributed to kind of how passive Hibs were for the second goal. Rangers have popped it about fairly well, but there's no real pressure on the ball, no serious pressure on the ball at any point. I think by the time it gets to Cantwell, it's actually Lewis Stevenson who steps in from full back to try and stop him getting the shot away. And it's a good finish, don't get me wrong. It's a good strike from that area. But at the same time, I think, it's preventable. Because I think they did a decent enough job for most of the first half, Hibs, for, stopping guys like Cantwell getting into those sort of areas, between midfield and attack where they can really hurt you. It didn't happen too often, but I think once Rangers started to get to grips with the midfield, that's where the game turned a wee bit. And then obviously the third goal's a bit of a mess, but the game it was pretty much gone by that point anyway. I couldn't see Hibs getting back into it. That was more sort of adding insult to injury rather than a really catastrophic moment in terms of the result. Just in terms of three new signings ended up on the pitch. Obviously Mazzani started the game, and then we had Emiliano Marcondes and Luke Amos on the bench. We've already touched a bit on Mazzani, Patrick, but just overall, did you see anything you liked from the three new boys?
Yeah, I think you mentioned that there was a lot of rustiness in all of them, which I think is to be expected. Marcondes obviously hasn't played sort of senior football since, I think, June last year. As mentioned, Mazzani's been playing sort of lower tier in Germany, and Luke Amos is another player who hasn't played a sort of senior game for a long time, and he's been training with Tottenham's under 23s. Obviously, Marcondes has been with Bournemouth, but you can't replicate that. You can't replicate games at this level, especially not against opposition like Rangers. And I think there's a few things at play here, and I will touch on what I liked. But I think whenever a team makes new signings, there's always this sort of clamour from the fans. They want to see them in action as soon as possible. And I think given Hibs' problems at the moment in terms of personnel, and you've got 4 players on international duty, and then you've got you've still got a good few players out injured. Chris Cadden, Jay Doyle-Hayes, Adam Lathonde, Josh Campbell. It's Paul Hanlon missing as well. It kind of gets down to it's what we were talking about before Christmas, where Hibs are kind of down to the bare bones again. And I think ideally Montgomery wouldn't have had to have started any of the new signings, but he almost feels like he has to, because I don't think there's anybody else. I don't think you play Rudy Molotnikov in that sort of supporting striker role against Rangers. I think that's a big ask. I think you want to try and bring youngsters like that through gradually. I don't think you want to chuck them into the deep end. I know you could argue they kind of did that with Canal and Migwa at right back, but again, do you put Rory Whittaker on from the start against Rangers? I mean, I know he's played, he's started for Hibs already this season, but again, it's a big ask, and you risk, I think, damaging their confidence. And it's really, I do feel a bit for Montgomery. Like it can't be straightforward thinking, I've got to put a team out that can compete. I've got to put a team out that can play the way I want them to play. And I mean, you can see when the starting lineup came out, we're sort of trying to think like who's played centre half here. There's three options. It could be playing centre half, and in the end, it was possibly the least likeliest option that ended up playing there and ended up playing very well. We should talk about Obita later, but I thought he was easily his best player on the park, head and shoulders above the rest. I don't think would be a stretch, and that's obviously. It's great that he's putting in that sort of performance, but again, it's this sort of like patchwork Hibs where you've got your left back playing a centre half, you've got an aging fullback being asked to sort of like get up and down the wing. And nothing against Lewis Stevenson, he's a top professional, he's kept himself fit, but you don't want to be relying on somebody who is 36 years old to be putting in 90-minute shifts against the likes of Celtic, Rangers, and things like that. It's just not. Obviously his abilities are going to be on the wane because, it's what happens with age. And, we've seen how effective Obita can be down that left-hand side. He's linked up really well with Tavares on that flank. But, it does feel a little bit like, Montgomery is really just trying to kind of get through this period where he doesn't have players for a variety of reasons and just, kind of limp on to the next game, get through it, rinse and repeat. And I think, it's difficult that he talks about bringing in new signings who are ready to sort of, ready to make an impact, can hit the ground running. I don't think any of the three signings that he's brought in are. And, it's just the nature of the window. It's the nature of, the positions that are needed. The January transfer window is difficult. We know this. And so, I think his hand's almost been forced. But what I would say is that I think we saw flashes from Mizani to suggest that he, could be an interesting addition to the final third. I'm not 100% sure whether you would want him starting on Saturday, for instance. I don't think he will, because I think Montgomery's the kind of person who'll maybe give him like an hour against Rangers and then maybe give him 20 to 30 minutes against Kilmarnock and just sort of build up that game time, because that's the only way they're going to be ready is if they're playing games. And when you take the weather into consideration, and there's not really much point in playing them in reserve games or bounce games because they're not going to get that same feeling of this is what it means to play for Hibs, this is what's required of me, this is the level that I have to be at for 90 plus minutes, 2 to 3 times a week. What I did like was Marcondes. I think you could see his quality when he came on. Like, yes, there was obviously rust with him as well because he's been out for such a long time, but I think some of his passing and just like moving into space, it's working the final third. I think you can tell that he's going to be a really good addition. And I mean, he sounds like a naturally fit guy. He was obviously out in Dubai of his own accord doing things when Hibs were out there, which obviously led to the signing actually happening. And I think I wouldn't be surprised to see him maybe starting on Saturday. And I think maybe just in that sort of supporting striker role we talked about, Mazzani's sort of suitability or lack of suitability for that role against Rangers. I think Marcondes has that sort of, knowledge, that sort of footballing brain to be able to, play that role really effectively. I think he's the player that Hibs have been crying out for in that position, because it's not Dylan Vente. You want him sort of playing as a number 9. You want him in and around the penalty box and getting on the end of whatever the wingers are putting into the box, whatever Marcondes is slipping through. But I think also he's more disciplined in the sense that, I mean, I know he said at Brentford he was played more as an 8 and he wanted to play as a 10, but I think he's got that sort of knowledge to know that he needs to drop deeper to sort of help the midfield out at times, because I don't see Montgomery changing the way they play, and I don't think anybody would argue against the fact that Hibs needed an identity. They needed sort of a recognisable style of play, and that's obviously what he's trying to implement. I'm just not convinced that in its current form it works. It doesn't work against Rangers. It doesn't work against 3-man midfields. And it becomes very easy to play around. It becomes very easy to counter. It becomes very easy to essentially sort of get the better of Hibs. And you can put that down again to the lack of players. You can put it down to Montgomery still not having had a full transfer window. I mean, a few days left. You'd imagine that it's probably going to be a centre back as the primary target at the moment. And obviously, yes, he's getting players back from injury. He's talked about them being like new signings, but I think questions do need to be asked about whether the current system is appropriate for every game. And I know that he's talked about it before. He's almost been a bit snippy, is a bit harsh, but I think he's been quite kind of insistent that this is the way we're going to play. This is the identity I want the club to have or the team to have, and we're not going to deviate from this too much. But I just think I've said it before that I think managers sometimes need to be a bit more pragmatic in certain situations. And you're not saying like go and play a 3-5-2 or a 5-4-1. It's, broadly speaking, you want them to play the same way. You just want it to be a setup that helps them a bit more. And I think hopefully the players who have come in can adapt to the way that Montgomery wants to play and can make a difference. But I think you have to reserve judgment. And if there's been one kind of consistent theme with Hibs recently, it's the sort of this system when Montgomery first came in worked quite well. They were getting decent results, and now it just, I think people have kind of cottoned on to the way that Montgomery's teams play.
Mm-hmm.
They know how to close them off to prevent them getting into attacking areas. They know how to play through them. They know where they're weak. They know where to attack them, and a lot of teams get a lot of joy out of doing that. And I just think that's maybe the next thing that needs to be looked at is basically, do you play the same way and then try and improve it all the time, or do you sort of take the hit and accept that sometimes you maybe need to adapt the way you're playing for the good of the team? Because at the end of the day, it's a results business. Montgomery knows this. He said that. Mm-hmm. I thought when he was speaking last night, he was putting a very kind of brave face on things, very, very positive comments about the players, about certain aspects of the game, whilst recognising that some of it had been disappointing. But it is getting to that stage where I think something needs to change, because if Hibs keep on playing the way that they are and not really getting anywhere and not having anything to show for it, then it doesn't, top six doesn't look like a certainty or a likelihood. It looks like it's going to be a tall order.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, if you're talking about identity, for me that's always been about and I'm sure you probably agree. It's less for me. It's always been less about formations and more about what do you want to be on the pitch? Do you want to be a high pressing team? Do you want to pass out from the back? Do you want to be direct? Do you want to play with wingers high and wide? It's always been about those kind of aspects. The things you actually do rather than the shape you set up in. So I don't think it is obviously a good thing that Montgomery has come in and he's tried to instill an identity into the team, a recognised way of playing. But I think he can hang on to those principles and still be able to maybe go with a three in midfield at some point. Especially for games against Rangers. And it's I'm sometimes reticent to be, too critical of a manager who comes into Scottish football and does try to implement a recognised way of playing, something a bit more forward thinking. And because I think there's a lot of teams in this league who don't really have that. They don't really have a sort of recognised way of playing. A lot of them play quite similarly. Mm-hmm. How many teams you see nowadays? Playing, three at the back, two midfielders, both of them quite defensive. Wing backs who are a lot less wing and more back. So you kind of really, like, when you see a guy come in and want to do things a bit differently, to want to play out against the bigger teams in the league, it makes you want that to succeed, because it can, if it works, then it's kind of better for it's obviously first and foremost it's good for Hibs, but it's kind of better for the overall product as well. And I know it's kind of scant consolation but Philip Clement and his post-match press conference, I know it's easy for managers to come out and say these kind of things when they've just won 3-0, but he was actually very complimentary of Hibs, and that's not me being cynical. It's just the way it is. They don't say it when they get beat, but he was actually complimentary of the way that Hibs are trying to play. He described them as being very good technically, good at build-up, and I think it is just kind of frustrating at times, because you feel like sometimes you feel that it's not that far away from working. But I do think, just to get back to the original point on identity, for me it's always been less about shape and formations. And that's just the kind of, you can do things within that. You can principles, as I said, are kind of more about what you do rather than the initial shape you set up in. But just kind of to touch on Marcondes before we move on, I did think that he brought a he did bring something when he came on. You can tell he's still got a bit to go in terms of getting match sharpness back, getting up to full speed. But I do think in that role, I think he can make a difference because he is kind of very naturally well suited to it, and he's played the number 8 roles and other roles in midfield to understand what's maybe required of it defensively as well. But just in terms of retaining the ball, I think he'll make a real difference. Where I feel like Hibs have struggled sometimes this season is is sustaining attacks, like sustaining possession in the opposition half. Like a lot of the time, it feels as though that they are building from back into midfield an awful lot of the game and not sustaining the ball. In games where they have most of the possession, but not quite sustaining it in the opposition half quite as much as they'd like. I think he'll make a difference in that regard. You can see he's got quality. He picks up good areas. He picks good passes, and obviously, I think he just like the others as well. I think he just needs a bit of time. I thought Amos showed a bit of something as well, just a bit something different in midfield, maybe a bit more kind of ability to get around. He was kind of snapping at people. He looked quite comfortable on the ball as well. I'm quite interested to see what he can do moving forward. But as you said earlier on, we're going to touch on Jordan Obita because he was, as you say, he was far and away Hibs' best player. He's been asked to step in and do something difficult. I think, as you pointed out in our report last night, he has done it before. Played there for Wickham, was it? He said, and he was quite not often, yeah, but he didn't look out of place. He was kind of trying to come out with the ball as well. He was in the right place at the right time quite a lot, and he's been really quietly effective for quite a while now, Jordan Obita, I think.
Yeah, I think when you look at who Hibs signed in the summer, obviously when you're shelling out as much money as they did for Dylan Bente, and you're finally getting Adam Lafondra after what feels like about 25 years of trying to get him through the door and being linked with him every transfer window, and even Dylan Levitt, who obviously his stock was quite high, full kind of Wales internationalist, and he'd done well at Dundee United, and obviously the Manchester United connection. You think this could be a player who could sort of really make a difference. I thought, just as a side note, I think you need, certainly going on last night, you need more from players like Dylan Levitt and Ellie Yuan if this Hibs team is going to be effective. And we talked about this before. We don't need to go over old ground too much. Yuan is one of those players. If he could do it every week, then he would not be at Hibs. Montgomery said this about Mazzani as well, sort of saying, if he could put it all together, if he was perfect, he wouldn't be at Hibs. He'd be at a Champions League club. And I think it's probably a similar case with Yuan. That it's just, I think he's got a lot of talent, and there's some things that he does are borderline outrageous in terms of how skillful they are. But it must be so frustrating at times to be playing, the same team as him, because I just think, there's times when it's like he doesn't really need to prove anything. Like, he's maybe beaten 2 men and then he can get rid of it, but he tries to beat a third and then loses it, or he does something brilliant and then follows it up with like a really kind of poor pass, or makes the wrong decision when he's got sort of 2 options. And I just sort of think, players like Yuan, like Levitt, you really need them to be, especially in games, especially in the bigger games, especially in games against Rangers, Celtic, Hearts, Aberdeen. In fact, every game, but especially in these games where, more questions are going to be asked of the team, you really need them to sort of step up and, kind of show why they're worthy of a start, and, why they could go on to bigger and better things. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think, obviously, Obita is much further on in his career than the likes of Yuan and Levitt, but I think he was one person who did exactly what you want to see players doing in games like that. He was asked to play out of position, but I thought really adapted really well. Just played, defensively in terms of organising the defence, really good at telling people where to go, where to stand, who to mark. The number of times he popped up with an interception or a tackle, a block, anything like that. It was just, I just felt it was a really sort of accomplished performance by a defender playing out of position against a really sort of like attack-minded team. And I certainly think the scoreline probably would have been a lot worse, or could have been a lot worse if it hadn't been for Obita. And I think you look at the signings that Hibs brought in the summer, and he almost went under the radar because it's just like, okay, yeah, we've signed a 30-year-old left back from Wickham. No one's going, people look at Ventus like, oh, we've paid a lot of money for a striker who scored a lot of goals. We've signed, someone like Adam Lafondra with his Premier League experience, and we've signed Dylan Levitt. We're sort of, we're bringing in all these players. It's going to be great, and okay, yeah, we've brought in a left back. That's fine. I mean, I don't think, not to sort of talk down left backs everywhere, but I just feel that when you're signing new players, obviously depending on who the left back is, but it's not the sexiest position.
Yeah, just as well you said that, because we would have the left back union on us in a flash.
I know. Well, I'm not daft. Just I've got a lot of respect for left backs. But no, I mean it's unfair because when you look at left backs, you look at Andy Robertson, Kieran Tierney, Josh Doig, even at Hibs if we're staying a bit closer to home. David Murphy going back a few years, even Lewis Stevenson. There's a place for left backs. This isn't an agenda, but I just think all joking aside, compared to the other signings they brought in, I think it was just sort of yes, we need left back cover, we've got that, that's fine. But I think in actual fact, in terms of consistency, in terms of performances since he's come in, I think Obita's probably been the one that's probably been the most sort of impressive. But it has kind of like flown under the radar a little bit. But I think last night that really kind of came to the fore, and I think there's probably a lot of Hibs fans out there maybe, and this isn't a criticism, but I think they maybe haven't realised just how good he is. And I think that's I think we'll start to see that more and more as the season goes on, that actually he does have a lot of quality, and whether that's playing at left centre back, at left back, left midfield, you name it. But I just think you need performances like that from far more players if you're going to get positive results. And quite frankly, we're not seeing that enough from enough Hibs players. And that's, I mean, Montgomery will be aware of that, I'm sure. The fact that him and Brian McDermott both talk about the importance of character in players, like they need to have the right character and they need to have the right sort of approach, as well as the ability to go out and put in a performance in a certain position. But you need to see more of that. You need to see more. I'm not quite saying we're dreaming of a team of Jordan Obitas, but you certainly
not yet.
Not yet. Give it time. But I do think you do need that sort of approach from far more players than we're currently seeing. And I think Saturday tomorrow would be a good time to start with that.
Aye, absolutely. I mean, all credit to Jordan Obita. He really kind of stood up when his team needed him. Just to touch on Youan and Levitt, as you were speaking about there, I think that it kind of sums up Ellie Youan in that it was a frustrating performance from him last night, but I still think he still managed to be Hibs' biggest threat, which just...
That's why it's so frustrating.
Yeah, because he had the shot where he cut in off the right, left-footed shot, made Butland make a good save in the first half. He's made a brilliant run, and he's been found by a great pass from Megwa, and then he's picked he's picked the perfect ball to cut it back to Mazzani. Yes. It would have been easy just to lash that across the face of goal, but he's picked the perfect ball, and that really should have been a goal. So it does it sums up why he is so frustrating, Ellie Youan, and that he did a fair few things as well that had people groaning all around us, but he still managed to be Hibs' biggest threat. Just Dylan Levitt as well. I mean, I've seen quite a fair bit of criticism of Levitt from last night. Some of it I agree with, and some of it I don't particularly agree with. I think there are question marks over him defensively in a midfield too. It's never, I think the defensive side of the game has probably never really been one of his strengths. He's probably been, I think, when he was at his best at Dundee United, I think he was playing in a midfield three a bit further on. There was probably less defensive responsibility placed on him there. It just doesn't seem to be really part of his game, because he's not you're not going to get that from him. He's not a water carrier. He is a ball player. Joe Newell as well. Joe Newell's not a water carrier either. He's I'd say I'd class Joe Newell as a ball player as well. But it's just there are kind of question marks there defensively, and I think you'd maybe see somebody like Levitt benefit from a guy who could maybe do a bit more of the dirty work. But I suppose you could say that for Joe Newell as well. Where I wouldn't agree necessarily with some of the criticism of Levitt, I've seen him being accused of hiding. I don't agree with that. I think he looks to get on the ball. He is always trying to make himself available, and some of his passing was a bit off last night. But I think he does it. He was one of the ones who at times were maybe trying to play that more progressive pass to try and play through Rangers, and they were kind of wise to it at times, and it wasn't coming off. But I don't necessarily agree with maybe claims that he hides in games. I feel like he does make himself available for the ball an awful lot, and at times he does try to get Hibs up the pitch. I just don't think it never come off from last night. I don't know. As the game wore on, he started to strike me as a guy who's maybe started to lose a bit of confidence in himself, a bit kind of unsure of himself on the ball. But yeah, just to maybe let's move things on a wee bit. We've devoted a good half hour to a 3-0 defeat. Just to finish up, shall we look ahead to the weekend? The games aren't. That was a really challenging way to come back to Premiership action last night. But in terms of it's a different challenge this weekend. But it's just a really far from simple one going to Kilmarnock, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and I think we probably saw that in Montgomery's first game in charge, which was away to Kilmarnock, where Hibs were up 2-0 and ended up conceding 2 goals late on to draw the game instead of winning it. And I think I do find it quite funny because obviously they're coming up against Derek McInnes, who is a man who a lot of Hibs fans would, I think going by social media, which I know is never the sort of most accurate or safest barometer to use, but a lot of fans been saying we wouldn't have minded seeing him in the Easter Road hot seat. And so I always think it's interesting when you see Hibs coming up against his Kilmarnock team, who have done quite well themselves this season, almost sort of flying under the radar a little bit as well. But it is difficult. I'm not going to sit here and try to cliches like there are no easy games, but there are. And I just think that it becomes there's sort of so many levels to this. Like in one sense, they need a reaction from Wednesday night's game. They also need points on the board if they're wanting to finish. I mean, Montgomery's already said they're still hoping to finish in one of the top 5 spaces. I mean, obviously, you'd have to say it's going to be 3rd, 4th, or 5th, and I think that you really need to be going into games like Saturday and thinking, almost having this belief that we can, you can take 3 points from it, that you can sort of, get a bit of breathing space and sort of break up what's been a pretty kind of rotten run of results, if not performances. And I think it just comes down to doing the sort of the simple things. I think they need to be able to take their chances. I think they need to be able to just get a bit more cohesion. I don't know if shuffling the personnel is going to make that easier. But I just think something needs to change in terms of the performance and the result, because you can sense that a lot of fans are starting to get really kind of browned off. And I think there are more fans questioning Montgomery, and I know you can say it's all well and good that he's it's not his team, and you have to give managers time, and that's something they don't get in the modern game, as we've seen, especially with Hibs managers. But I think it needs to be a better performance all round than Wednesday. I mean, we've said there were good elements to Wednesday. I felt, given from what we'd seen before the winter break, you could see maybe what had been worked on in Dubai. There were some things that worked quite well. And the hope is that, if Hibs go to Kilmarnock and play like they did for maybe the first 25, 30 minutes against Rangers and maintain that, then, they're giving themselves a much better chance of getting a result. Not to take away from Kilmarnock. I think Kilmarnock have been really impressive most of the times I've seen them, but, they're not unbeatable. And, I would... Montgomery doesn't strike me as the kind of guy to sort of say, well, remember when we came here in September and we were 2-0 up and we drew 2-2. go and make things right. I don't think he's the kind of guy who does that. He's very much, you don't live in the past, focus on the here and the now. But it'd be nice to sort of think, they can go there and think, right, we've been here before and did a lot of good things. I know they got a point for it. Let's go and do a lot of good things and actually take the 3 points this time. Because that's, I think, you're talking about Dylan Levitt and his confidence. I think the players need a bit of a confidence boost from a result. They need a bit of a confidence boost from a performance. And, I think going to Kilmarnock, which is not the easiest place to go, and, getting 3 points would certainly go a long way to contributing to that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think we'll leave it there for today. I know that was a fairly miserable morning debrief, but it was off the back of a fairly miserable result, unfortunately. But yeah, if you've come across this video on YouTube and you feel that you could maybe tolerate watching us again at some point in the future, I would urge you to please hit the subscribe button. It makes a huge difference to us. It means we can keep bringing you these videos. Hopefully next time after a more positive result for Hibs. Just in terms of the Hibs Observer website today, we'll have more reaction from last night's game. We will actually hear from Emiliano Marcondes after his Hibs debut with what I promise you is one of the most colourful analogies I've ever heard from a footballer. So please keep your eye out from that. It might lift the gloom a wee bit ahead of the weekend. Just in terms of the weekend, obviously, we'll be back on Friday with everything from Nick Montgomery's press conference as Hibs prepare for a trip to Kilmarnock, looking to get themselves back on track in the Premiership. But for now, thank you as always for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.